He was the son of a farmer. He grew up in a frontier settlement so small it barely appeared on maps. His family ran a blacksmith shop in Newcastle, Ontario, with 4 employees and a customer base that extended no further than the surrounding fields. You would think a rural Canadian kid with no engineering training, no capital, and no connections would never build a global industrial empire, right? Well, Hart Massey would create the largest farm machinery manufacturer on the planet. He would mechanize the harvest for an entire civilization. He would put his name on every prairie in Canada, every field in Britain, every farm in Australia. And he would do it starting from a blacksmith shop that nobody outside of one small Ontario county had ever heard of. So how did a farm boy from the Canadian frontier change the way the world feeds itself? To find out, we have to go back to 1823, February 29th, 1823. Hart Massey was born in Haldimand Township, Ontario, the son of a farmer and part-time blacksmith who had crossed the border from Vermont looking for land and a fresh start. The Canada that Hart was born into was not yet a country. It was a collection of British colonies clinging to the southern edge of an enormous wilderness, where survival meant farming. And farming meant something most people today cannot fully imagine. Every seed was planted by hand. Every stalk of wheat was cut by hand. Every bushel was bound, carried, and threshed by hand. A single family might spend 3 full weeks doing nothing but harvesting grain in the autumn, working from first light to last light. Every able-bodied person pressed into service, racing the frost that would destroy everything they had worked for all year. There was no margin. There was no rest. The harvest consumed everything, and if the harvest failed, the family failed with it. Daniel Massey understood this world intimately. In 1847, he established a small foundry in Newcastle, Ontario, manufacturing basic farm implements for the local farming community. Plows, harrows, simple hand tools. It was modest by any measure. 4 employees, a regional reputation, a business built entirely on local necessity with no ambition beyond serving the farms within a day's wagon ride. Daniel was a practical man solving practical problems for his neighbors. That was enough for him. It was not enough for Hart. From his earliest years working alongside his father, Hart showed something his father did not have. Not technical skill, not engineering genius, something rarer. He had the ability to look at a small thing and see the large thing it could become. Where Daniel counted customers in dozens, Hart counted them in thousands. Where Daniel saw a foundry that served Newcastle, Hart saw a foundry that could serve a continent. The Canadian prairies stretched west for thousands of miles, largely unsettled, waiting. The settlers would come. Hart understood this before the settlers themselves knew they were coming. In 1851, Hart traveled to London for the Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace, the largest showcase of industrial technology the world had ever seen. There, he watched Cyrus McCormick demonstrate his mechanical reaper before an international audience. The machine moved through a field of grain and cut in hours what a crew of men would spend days cutting by hand. The crowd was astonished. Hart was calculating. He understood immediately that this technology would transform agriculture across North America. He also understood something McCormick did not. The Canadian farmer was not the American farmer. The Canadian climate was harsher. The Canadian settler poorer. The Canadian market entirely different. McCormick was building for Illinois. Hart would build for Ontario, for Manitoba, for every frozen frontier farm that McCormick had never thought about. He came home from London with one idea fixed in his mind: not to copy the Americans, to beat them on their own continent. Hart took control of the family business in the early 1850s and began remaking it immediately. The first thing he did was narrow the focus. The Newcastle foundry had made a general range of farm implements, a little of everything for anyone who walked through the door. Hart ended that. From this point forward, Massey would make one thing only: agricultural machinery. Not plows for gardens, not tools for carpenters. Machines that addressed the single greatest bottleneck in Canadian farming: the harvest. Reaping, binding, threshing. The three operations that consumed the most time, destroyed the most families, and caused the most losses when the weather turned without warning. It was a total bet on a market that did not yet exist at the scale Hart was imagining. His neighbors thought he was narrowing himself into a corner. Hart knew he was positioning himself for everything that was coming. The problem he faced next was distribution. Canada in the 1850s had no national transportation network worth the name. Selling beyond a 50-mile radius means wagons on unpaved roads, weeks in transit, machines arriving damaged or not arriving at all. Every competitor accepted this as a permanent condition of doing business in Canada. Hart treated it as a problem to be solved before anyone else solved it. He began building a dealer network, placing authorized local agents in agricultural communities across Ontario, men who would stock Massey implements, demonstrate them to farmers, handle basic repairs, and place orders directly with the foundry. The farmer did not need to travel to Newcastle to buy a Massey machine. The Massey machine came to the farmer. It was a distribution model decades ahead of its time, and Hart built it patiently, town by town, across the province. Then the railways arrived. When the Grand Trunk Railway began connecting Ontario communities through the late 1850s and into the 1860s, Hart was ready in a way no competitor was. The dealer network already existed. The production capacity was already expanding. The railway did not create the Massey distribution system. It simply accelerated something that had been built and waiting. Overnight, markets that had been unreachable became accessible. Towns that had been 2 weeks away by wagon were now 2 days away by rail. In 1879, Hart made the move that announced Massey's arrival as a national force. He relocated manufacturing operations from Newcastle to Toronto, establishing the Massey Manufacturing Company on King Street West, in a facility that would become one of the largest industrial complexes in Canada. It was not just a business decision. It was a statement. Hart Massey was no longer running a regional foundry. He was building a national institution, and he was moving to the center of the country to do it. Hart Massey understood something about his customers that his competitors never figured out. He was not selling iron. He was not selling machinery. He was selling time. A Canadian farm family in the 1860s spent 3 weeks every autumn harvesting grain by hand. 3 weeks of dawn to dusk, cutting, binding, and stacking, with every member of the family pressed into service, racing the clock before the first frost destroyed everything they had grown all year. A Massey mechanical reaper cut those 3 weeks to 3 days. Not a marginal improvement, a transformation of human life. Hart knew this, and he marketed accordingly. At agricultural exhibitions across Ontario and beyond, Massey demonstrators did not talk about gear ratios or blade specifications. They talked about what a farmer could do with 3 weeks he had never had before. Plant more acreage next season. Repair the barn before winter. Watch his children grow up instead of watching them labor. But Hart understood that even the most compelling product is worthless if the customer cannot afford to buy it. The settlers pouring into Canadian farmland were land-rich and cash-poor. They had mortgaged everything to acquire their acreage. Paying cash up front for a piece of machinery was simply impossible for most of them. Hart introduced installment payment plans tied directly to the harvest cycle. The farmer paid when his crop came in, not before. This single decision opened the Massey customer base to an entirely new class of buyer and closed the door on every competitor who was still demanding cash on delivery. Then came the Americans. By the 1870s, Cyrus McCormick's operation had identified Canada as a critical export market and was moving aggressively to capture it. McCormick had resources that dwarfed anything Massey could match. An industrial machine built on American capital, American scale, professional sales forces, and predatory pricing designed to drive Canadian competitors out of the market permanently. The conventional wisdom said Massey could not survive it. Hart did not lower his prices. He did something far more intelligent. He made it safer to own a Massey machine than any other machine on the market. The Massey dealer in every small agricultural town was not just a sales agent. He was a trained mechanic who could repair any Massey machine in the field within 24 hours, with parts stocked locally. When a Massey binder broke down in the middle of harvest, help arrived the next morning. When a McCormick machine broke down, the nearest qualified mechanic might be 50 miles away. In a Canadian autumn where the harvest window was measured in days and a single mechanical failure could ruin an entire year, that difference was everything. Farmers remembered. They told their neighbors. They told their sons. By the early 1880s, Massey was the dominant farm machinery brand in Canada. Not because it had beaten the Americans on technology, because it had beaten them on trust. By 1891, two companies dominated Canadian farm machinery: Massey Manufacturing in Toronto and A. Harris, Son and Company in Brantford, Ontario. Alanson Harris had built his business on the same principles as Hart Massey: quality implements, reliable service, practical design for Canadian conditions. And the two companies had spent years competing fiercely for the same customers across the same territory. It was expensive, redundant, and strategically wasteful for both of them. Hart saw it clearly. The real competition was not Harris. The real competition was McCormick, Deering, and the full weight of American industrial capital that was determined to own the Canadian market permanently. Splitting the Canadian industry between two domestic rivals while the Americans consolidated was a strategy for losing slowly. Hart was not interested in losing at any speed. In 1891, he orchestrated the merger of Massey Manufacturing and A. Harris, Son and Company. The new entity was Massey-Harris Company Limited, headquartered in Toronto, and immediately the largest farm machinery manufacturer in the entire British Commonwealth. It was the most significant industrial merger in Canadian history to that point. No Canadian businessman had ever engineered anything of this scale. In a single transaction, Hart had eliminated his primary domestic competitor, doubled production capacity, combined two dealer networks into one national system, and created a company large enough to compete with the American giants on something approaching equal terms. Export operations expanded immediately into Britain, Australia, Argentina, and South Africa. Massey-Harris was no longer thinking about Canada. It was thinking about every agricultural market on Earth. Hart Massey died on February 20th, 1896, 5 years after the merger he had spent his career building toward. He was 72 years old. He left behind the largest farm machinery company in the Commonwealth and a personal legacy that extended far beyond the factory floor. In 1894, 2 years before his death, he donated the funds to construct Massey Hall on Victoria Street in downtown Toronto, a concert hall seating nearly 3,000 people, built as a gift to the city that the Massey Company had helped make an industrial center. It opened on June 14, 1894, and would go on to host Winston Churchill, Enrico Caruso, and Neil Young. It was restored in 2021 at a cost of $135 million and still stands today. A blacksmith's son built one of the great concert venues in North America and gave it away. But the company's greatest chapter was still ahead. In 1953, Massey-Harris merged with Ferguson, the company founded by Harry Ferguson, the Ulster engineer who had invented the three-point hydraulic hitch that transformed the modern tractor. Ferguson had sued Ford over the stolen design and won the largest patent settlement in American industrial history at that time, $9 million in 1952. He brought that technology into the merged company. Massey-Ferguson was born. The red and gray tractors began rolling off the lines in Coventry and Toronto. The MF-135 followed, compact, reliable, priced for the working farmer, and it became the best-selling tractor in history. The logo was on every prairie in Canada, every field in Britain, every farm in Australia. Every Canadian rural family over 60 either owned one or knew someone who did. By the mid-1970s, the world that had made Massey-Ferguson dominant was coming apart. The oil crisis of 1973 had sent fuel prices through the roof and dragged the global economy into a recession that hit agricultural communities especially hard. Commodity prices collapsed. Interest rates climbed to levels that made borrowing impossible for the farmers who were Massey-Ferguson's entire customer base. A farmer who had planned to buy a new tractor in 1975 was now just trying to hold on to his land. New machinery purchases stopped almost completely across North America, across Britain, across Australia. The markets that Massey-Ferguson had spent a century building went silent at the same time, all of them, with no warning. The company had been expanding aggressively through the 1960s, building new factories, taking on debt, growing its operations on the assumption that the agricultural boom would continue indefinitely. When the boom ended, Massey-Ferguson was left with enormous fixed costs, massive debt obligations, and a revenue base that had collapsed beneath them. By 1978, the losses were severe. By 1980, the company was effectively insolvent, unable to service its debts without outside intervention. The largest farm machinery manufacturer on the planet, the company that Hart Massey had built from a four-man foundry in Newcastle, Ontario, was on the edge of disappearing entirely. What followed was a national crisis in Canada. Massey-Ferguson was not just a company, it was a symbol. It employed thousands of workers in Toronto and across the country. It carried a century of Canadian industrial identity in its name. The question of whether to save it became a political debate at the highest levels of government. The Trudeau administration faced enormous pressure from labor unions, from the agricultural community, from anyone who understood what the Massey name meant to Canadian manufacturing history. The government ultimately extended financial support. Private investors moved in. The company was restructured, rationalized, and broken into pieces. Manufacturing operations were sold off. The corporate structure was dismantled. What had once been a single global empire became a collection of smaller entities trading on the remnants of a great name. The Massey-Ferguson brand itself survived. It passed through several corporate hands before landing with AGCO Corporation, the American agricultural equipment giant that still produces Massey-Ferguson tractors today. The red and gray machines are still being built. The name is still on the hood. In farm equipment dealerships across Canada, across Britain, across 100 other countries, the Massey-Ferguson badge is still recognized instantly by anyone who has ever worked the land. Hart Massey started with a blacksmith shop and 4 employees in a village nobody had heard of. 170 years later, his name is still on the tractor. Hart Massey never invented a single machine. He never held a patent. He never spent a day in engineering school. What he understood was something more powerful than invention. He understood that mechanizing the harvest was not a product. It was a promise. The promise that a Canadian farm family could gather their crop and still have a life worth living. He built that promise into the largest agricultural machinery empire on Earth, starting from a blacksmith shop in a village nobody had heard of. The company collapsed. The brand survived. Because some things, built carefully enough and honestly enough, outlast everything. That is how a blacksmith's son from Ontario fed the world.